My sister abandoned her baby at the hospital. I adopted her and raised her for 5 years. But when she returns demanding custody, my own parents side with her. We end up in court, and the judge's decision left them broken. I'm 31 years old, work in real estate, and I need to tell this story because it basically destroyed my relationship with my entire family, but at the same time, it's the best thing I've ever done. The thing is, I adopted my niece when she was born because my younger sister abandoned her at the hospital, and 5 years later, that same sister decided she wanted her back, like just out of nowhere. And when I say it was a disaster, I'm understating it, because we ended up in court with my own parents sitting on her side supporting her. But I guess I should start from the beginning, so all of this makes sense. I grew up being the responsible daughter. You know, the one who always has to set an example and can never mess up because she's the oldest. My sister Kimberly, who's 4 years younger than me, was totally spoiled, the golden child, as they say now. If I got a 9 on a test, my parents would ask why it wasn't a 10. If Kimberly got a 7, they'd buy her ice cream to celebrate that. She at least passed. It's not that my parents were bad. I mean, they loved us both. But it was always obvious that Kimberly could get away with things I wouldn't have even thought to try. I had to be home at 9 at night when I was 17. Kimberly could come home at 1 in the morning at 15, and my parents would just say, well, she's young, let her have fun. That dynamic basically defined our entire childhood and adolescence. When I was 23 and finishing college, Kimberly was 19 and still living at my parents' house, not doing much. She'd started college but dropped out after the first semester because she said she didn't like it, and my parents didn't pressure her to do anything. So one day I get a call from my mom at 7 in the morning, crying, and I thought someone had died or something. I got scared, horrible. Turns out Kimberly was pregnant. Pregnant like 5 months along, you know, one of those situations where the girl hides her belly and nobody notices until it can't be hidden anymore. The father was a guy she met at a party. She didn't even know his full last name. It had been a one-night thing, and she didn't even have his phone number. My parents are super religious. Like full-on Catholics. They go to Mass every Sunday and all that, so abortion wasn't even an option to discuss, according to them. Kimberly begged them to let her get an abortion. I heard her on the phone one day crying and screaming that she didn't want to be a mother, that she wasn't ready, that it would ruin her life. But my parents didn't want to hear it. They told her it was her responsibility, that God had a plan, all those phrases religious people say when they don't want to deal with the reality of a situation. The ironic thing is that later, all that responsibility talk went out the window, but I'll get to that. The next few months were horrible. Kimberly was miserable, cried all the time, didn't want to leave her room, barely ate. I'd go visit her on weekends, because I was still at college, which was like 2 hours away, and every time I saw her, she was worse. I tried talking to my parents, like, hey, this isn't right. She clearly doesn't want this baby. You should at least consider adoption. But they insisted that once the baby was born, Kimberly would change her mind, that maternal instinct would magically appear. I wasn't so sure, honestly, because I knew my sister, and when she didn't want something, she really didn't want it. Isabella was born in March, on a Tuesday around 3 in the morning. My parents called me and I went straight to the hospital. When I got there, Kimberly was in her room facing the wall. She wouldn't even look at the baby. The nurse had Isabella in one of those clear plastic cribs and nobody was holding her. She was so tiny, like she weighed less than 6 pounds, and she was just there alone, crying softly. Something broke inside me in that moment. I don't know how to explain it, but I picked her up and held her in my arms, and she immediately stopped crying. My parents were trying to convince Kimberly to at least hold her once, but she just kept saying no, 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 get her out of here. I don't want to see her. The next day, Kimberly left the hospital. She literally got up, got dressed, and left. She signed all the parental rights termination papers the hospital put in front of her, didn't even read them, just kept signing and signing. My parents were in total shock. I think they finally realized she'd been serious this whole time. The hospital told us that Isabella would stay there until the social services system could place her with a temporary family while they processed the adoption. It was going to be like 2 or 3 days minimum, maybe a week. I couldn't stand the idea of Isabella starting her life being passed from hand to hand through the system. I know there are wonderful temporary families, but I also know there are many that aren't, and the idea of this baby that nobody wanted being bounced between strangers destroyed me. So I did something kind of impulsive. I mean, It wasn't completely without thinking, but I didn't think about all the consequences either. I told the social worker I would adopt her, that I was her aunt, that I was family, that I could give her a stable home. The guy looked at me like I was crazy, because I was 23 years old and in my last year of college. But we started the process anyway. My boyfriend at the time, Nathan, didn't take it well. We'd been dating for like 2 years, lived together in an apartment near campus, and when I told him I was going to adopt Isabella, he basically gave me an ultimatum. He told me it's her or me. I can't raise someone else's kid. This is going to ruin our plans. We're too young. The whole list of reasons why it was a bad idea. And I understood. I mean, technically he was right that it would change everything. But when I looked at it that way, all I could think was that Isabella didn't ask to be born. I didn't ask to be abandoned. And if I didn't help her, who would? So I told him I was sorry, but I was going to do it anyway. He left that same week, packed his things and moved in with a friend, and that was basically the end of that relationship. The next few months were, without exaggerating, the hardest of my life. I finished college with a newborn baby, worked part-time in an office doing filing and answering phones because I needed the money, and basically didn't sleep. Isabella cried a lot the first few weeks, had colic or something, and there were nights where I also cried with her because I was so tired I couldn't even think straight. My best friend Hannah was my complete salvation. She'd come help me when she could, sleep on my couch so I could at least sleep 4 hours straight. My parents helped sometimes, but it was weird. Like they wanted to help, but they were also processing everything that had happened with Kimberly. And I think seeing me with Isabella reminded them of their younger daughter's failure. Kimberly completely disappeared. I'm not exaggerating. Like she left and we didn't hear from her for 5 years. At first, my parents tried to contact her, sent her messages, called her, but she never responded. Eventually, she changed her number and basically erased herself from our lives. I went on with my life. Finally graduated, got a real job in real estate that paid decent, moved to a bigger apartment, and raised Isabella alone. She was, and still is, the light of my life. She was such a sweet kid. Smart, curious, always asking questions about everything. She called me Mom from when she started talking, and I never corrected her because for all practical purposes, I was her mom. Legally, I was too. The adoption was finalized when she was like 8 months old. When Isabella was 5 years old and about to start kindergarten, I got an Instagram message from Kimberly. I almost had a heart attack when I saw her name appear on my phone. The message said something like, "Hi, Christina. I know it's been a long time. I've been working on myself and I'd love to reconnect. Especially I'd like to meet Isabella." Just that casual, like she'd been away for a week on vacation, and not 5 complete years without giving any signs of life. I responded asking her what exactly she meant by meet Isabella, and she called me. We had a long conversation where basically she told me she'd been traveling, that she'd gone to therapy, that now she had a stable job in another city and felt she was in a better place emotionally to be part of Isabella's life. I told her I'd think about it, but honestly, I wasn't sure what to think. On one hand, part of me wanted Isabella to have the opportunity to know her biological mother if that's what Kimberly genuinely wanted. On the other hand, I was afraid she'd show up. Isabella would get attached to her, and then she'd disappear again. I talked to my parents about this because honestly, I didn't know what to do. They, of course, were on Kimberly's side immediately. They told me everyone deserves a second chance, that she was young when everything happened, that she'd clearly changed. I reminded them that Isabella didn't know anything about Kimberly, beyond that her biological mom hadn't been able to take care of her when she was born, that for Isabella, I was her mom, period. They said it was selfish of me to keep them apart, that Kimberly had a right to know her daughter. That word, right, infuriated me so much. Like abandoning your baby at the hospital gave you automatic rights 5 years later. In the end, against my better judgment, I agreed to let Kimberly meet her. I thought maybe it would be better to do it on my terms, in a controlled place, than to wait for her to do something more drastic. The first meeting was at my parents' house on a Sunday. Isabella was nervous, kept grabbing onto my leg, and Kimberly arrived with a bunch of expensive gifts, like a giant doll that probably cost like $200, designer clothes, books. She was clearly trying to buy Isabella's affection, and it worked in the sense that Isabella got excited about the toys, but she stayed glued to me the whole time. Kimberly started visiting us more often after that. She'd come every 2 or 3 weeks, always with gifts, always trying to be the fun and cool aunt. Isabella started warming up to her eventually, would ask when Kimberly was coming again, and that made me nervous, but I also thought maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe Kimberly had genuinely changed and this could work. And then, like 6 months after the visit started, Kimberly asked me if she could take Isabella for a weekend. She said she wanted to spend more time with her, take her to the zoo and for ice cream, like aunt and niece things. I told her no. I explained that Isabella barely really knew her, that a whole weekend was too much too soon, that maybe in the future but not now. Kimberly didn't take it well. She told me I was controlling, that I was trying to keep her away from her daughter, that she had rights. I told her that legally she had no rights, that she'd given up all those rights when she signed those papers at the hospital, and that if she kept pushing, I'd have to stop letting her come altogether. She got furious, started yelling at me that I wasn't her real mother, that I was just playing house with her baby, that someday Isabella would grow up and want to know her real mom, and would hate me for keeping them apart. It was horrible. Isabella was in her room but probably heard everything because later she asked me why her aunt was screaming. Kimberly left slamming the door and I didn't hear from her for like 2 weeks. But then I started getting messages from my parents, from my aunt, even from a cousin I barely see, all telling me I was being too hard on Kimberly, that she just wanted to be part of her daughter's life, that I should be more understanding. It was like everyone had decided I was the villain in this situation for not letting Kimberly come in and out of Isabella's life whenever she felt like it. Nobody seemed to remember or care that she'd abandoned her, that I'd been the one getting up at 3 in the morning when Isabella cried, who paid her medical bills, who took her to school every day. My mom came to my house one day when Isabella was at school and we had a long conversation. She told me that Kimberly was considering legal options, that she'd talked to a lawyer about visitation rights or even joint custody. I told her that was ridiculous, that she had no legal basis, that she'd permanently given up her rights. My mom told me that a judge might see things differently, that they might decide it was best for Isabella to have a relationship with her biological mother, especially now that Kimberly was stable. She suggested I consider a joint custody arrangement voluntarily to avoid court. I told her to get out of my house. Things escalated super fast after that. Kimberly actually hired a lawyer and filed a petition in court for joint custody. Her argument was that she'd been depressed when Isabella was born, that she hadn't been in a condition to make clear decisions, that now she was better and wanted to rectify her mistake. Conveniently, she left out the part where she disappeared for 5 complete years without trying to contact us even once. I hired Patrick, a lawyer Hannah recommended, and he assured me we had a strong case, that judges almost never reverse finalized adoptions, especially when the biological parent voluntarily abandoned the child. But I was still terrified. The idea that a judge could decide to take Isabella from me, or even force me to share her with Kimberly, kept me up at night. Isabella knew something was happening. She'd ask me why I was sad, why her Aunt Kimberly wasn't coming anymore, why her grandparents weren't picking her up from school like before. I didn't know how to explain to her that basically our entire family had turned against us. The worst was when Kimberly started showing up at Isabella's school. She wasn't doing anything illegal technically, just standing outside the fence at dismissal time, watching. The first time I saw her there, I almost called the police, but Patrick told me there wasn't much I could do unless she tried to approach Isabella or threatened me directly. It was her way of intimidating me, of showing me she could access Isabella even if I didn't want her to. The school principal agreed not to let anyone but me pick up Isabella, but it was still terrifying seeing her there every afternoon. The court hearing was on a day in September, like at 9 in the morning. Hannah came with me for moral support. Isabella stayed with her kindergarten teacher because I asked her as a special favor. When I entered the courtroom, my parents were there sitting behind Kimberly. They didn't even look at me when I walked past. That hurt more than I expected. Seeing my own parents literally on the other side of the room supporting Kimberly in her attempt to take my daughter from me. Kimberly's lawyer presented their case first. Basically painted Kimberly as a girl who had made a mistake being very young, who had worked on herself, who now had a stable job and a 2-bedroom apartment, who wanted to be part of her biological daughter's life. Kimberly cried on the stand, said she regretted abandoning her every day, that not a day went by without thinking about Isabella, that she just wanted the chance to be her mother. It was a convincing performance. I'm not going to lie. If I hadn't lived through the whole story, maybe I would have even believed her. Then Patrick presented our case. He brought evidence that Kimberly hadn't tried to contact us in 5 years, that she'd changed her number so she couldn't be found, that her own parents had lost contact with her for years. He showed my custody records, my bank statements showing Isabella's expenses, and witnesses who testified that I'd been the only mother figure in Isabella's life since she was born. Hannah testified. My boss testified. Even Isabella's teacher sent a letter saying that Isabella always talked about her mom, Christina, and had never mentioned Kimberly until a few months ago when she started visiting us. I also had to testify. Patrick asked me questions about why I adopted Isabella, what it had been like raising her, what kind of relationship we had. I told him the truth, that I adopted her because I couldn't stand the idea of her being unwanted, that the last 5 years had been the hardest but also the most rewarding of my life, that Isabella was my daughter in all the ways that mattered. Kimberly's lawyer tried to make me look selfish, asked me if I didn't think Isabella deserved to know her biological mother, if I wasn't acting out of jealousy or resentment toward my sister. I told him it had nothing to do with Kimberly, and everything to do with protecting Isabella from being hurt again by someone who had already abandoned her once. The judge took a recess to deliberate, and those 2 hours were the longest of my life. Hannah held my hand the whole time. Patrick told me he was confident, but you never know. I could only think about Isabella and what would happen if I lost. When the judge came back and started talking, I felt like I was going to throw up. He said he'd carefully reviewed all the evidence, that he understood this was a complex situation with strong emotions on both sides. He said he recognized that Kimberly seemed to have made positive changes in her life and that her desire to know her biological daughter came from a genuine place. But, he said, and that but was the best sound I heard in my life. The child's well-being had to be the main priority. He said that Isabella had spent her entire life with one consistent mother figure, that altering that stability could be harmful to her, especially given that Kimberly had been voluntarily absent during critical developmental years. He denied Kimberly's petition and confirmed that I would maintain full custody of Isabella. Kimberly started crying. My parents got up and left without saying anything to me, and I just sat there trying to process that it was over, that Isabella was still mine, that nobody could take her from me. Hannah hugged me and we both cried right there in the courtroom, and Patrick shook my hand and told me I'd done the right thing all along. After that, I cut off contact with my parents completely. I sent them a message saying that their decision to support Kimberly over me had shown where their priorities were, and that until they could acknowledge the harm they caused and genuinely apologize, they weren't going to be part of our lives. I haven't talked to them in almost 2 years. Sometimes I miss my mom, especially when Isabella does something cute, and I think my mom would like to see it. But then I remember she chose the side of the person who abandoned her granddaughter over the side of the person who raised her, and it passes. Isabella is 7 years old now. She's in 2nd grade, loves art and hates math, has a super tight group of friends, and is in dance classes on Saturdays. She hasn't asked about Kimberly in a long time, and I don't bring it up. Someday, when she's older, I'll tell her the whole story if she wants to know it. But for now, she just knows that her Aunt Kimberly couldn't take care of her when she was born, and that I adopted her because I loved her very much. And that's enough. Last week, she asked me if she could invite her grandparents to her dance recital. I explained, trying to keep it simple, that sometimes adults have disagreements and need time apart, and that my parents and I were having one of those times. She asked me if it would ever get fixed, and I told her I didn't know. She thought about it for a moment and then said, well, at least I have Hannah as a grandmother. She always comes to my stuff, anyway. And she was right. Hannah has been there at every birthday, every recital, every school play, more than my own parents were even before all this drama. I don't know if I did everything perfectly. I probably made mistakes along the way, but when I see Isabella laugh or when she hugs me before bed and tells me I love you, Mom, I know I made the right decision. She wasn't a mistake that needed to be corrected, or an object that Kimberly could claim after years of absence. She was, and is, a small person who deserved to be loved consistently from day one. And if that makes me the villain in my family's story, then I guess I can live with that.